The Tower is a short story written by the English writer Marghanita Laski and was published in 1955. It tells the story of Caroline, a young Englishwoman living in Florence with her new husband Neville, who works for the British Council, an organisation that promotes British culture abroad. Feeling the weight of her husband's expectations that she should have an appreciation of Italian culture beyond that found in the city's museums and galleries, she strikes out on her own into the Tuscan countryside, armed with nothing more than an Italian guidebook, in search of a cultural discovery that her husband may not already have made. A description of a building named the Tower of Sacrifice catches her eye. Built in 1535 by a certain Niccolo di Ferramano, it was the only one to remain intact after a mysterious catastrophe in 1549 completely laid waste to the surrounding village. His name brings to mind a portrait that she saw with her husband on a tour of a private gallery. Not only of him, but also of his young wife who died shortly after their marriage. Even though she has a feeling of uneasiness about it that she is unable to quite put her finger on, she resolves to make time to visit the tower, despite the setting sun making returning home the most sensible thing to do. In the expectation of seeing a wonderful view from the top, she begins to climb the 470 steps of the tower in the dark, even though she can't see where she is going and the handrail is rusted and broken. Increasingly terrified, she continues feeling her way, only to realise how far from the ground she is when she eventually reaches the narrow viewing platform. This leads her to suffer an attack of vertigo. She feels dizzy and is gripped by an urge to jump. Pulling herself together, she begins the hazardous descent, obsessively counting the steps as she goes. The story ends as we realise with horror that there are more steps on the way down than there were on the way up, and that there is no sign of them coming to an end. Laski utilises a third-person narrator with limited omniscience to tell her story. In other words, the third-person narration is focused through the eyes of a single character. In seeing everything from Caroline's perspective, the reader gets an enhanced sense of the claustrophobia that she feels, not only in the tower itself, but also in her marriage to Neville. A writer concerned with gender issues at a time when very traditional male and female roles within marriage were the norm, Laski skillfully employs recognisable narrative elements of Gothic horror to explore themes of male dominance and control. Gothic horror is characterised by motifs of power, confinement and isolation, where ruthless men subjugate and terrorise helpless and innocent women. The atmosphere is generally dark and brooding, and locations such as castles or manors set in inhospitable and isolated landscapes are often used to reflect the psychological state of the narrator and/or main character. The writer generates a sense of terror through a focus on religion, the supernatural or the occult, and the narrative is frequently set in the medieval period. The Tower of Sacrifice can be seen as a metaphor, a phallic symbol of male dominance and control, and the sacrifice imposed upon females by a patriarchal society. Laski depicts marriage as an unequal partnership, characterised by a sense of duty, where the female is trapped and subsumed by the desires and values of the male. Any attempts to challenge this authority are fundamentally futile, and it seems that Caroline's mini-rebellion, that of being proactive and independent in seeking to make a cultural discovery for herself, rather than passively being the recipient of knowledge passed down to her by her husband, leads her to pay the ultimate price for her audacity. The fact that the tower is the only thing that wasn't destroyed in the village which surrounded it suggests its permanence and appears to imply that male control is enduring because it is so deeply culturally embedded that it is rendered unassailable. The story begins innocuously enough with a fictional extract from a guidebook, but Laski skillfully uses this to set up her key narrative elements, while initially downplaying their significance. The road begins to rise in a series of gentle curves, passing through pleasing groves of olives and vines. 5 kilometres on the left is the fork for Florence. To the right may be seen the Tower of Sacrifice, 470 steps, built in 1535 by Niccolo di Ferramano. Superstitious fear left the tower intact when, in 1549, the surrounding village was completely destroyed. Note not only how Laski creates a picture of a pleasantly rolling and bucolic landscape with her description of gentle curves and pleasing groves of olives and vines, but also how she introduces a note of threat with the ominous-sounding Tower of Sacrifice, apparently saved by superstitious fear, and the destroyed village surrounding it. The way this event occurred in the distant past, at the end of the medieval period some 400 years before the narrative present, however, makes it seem like a historical curiosity that can have no bearing on the here and now, and lulls Caroline and the reader into a false sense of security. Through placing the fact that the tower has 470 steps in parenthesis, Laski slips this vital piece of information under the radar by making it seem, at this point, like an extra and non-essential piece of information that has just been included to make it read more like an authentic guidebook, although it will actually be central to the sense of horror that she intends to inflict on the reader at the end. The literal fork in the road, with Florence to the left and the tower to the right, will also become a metaphorical fork in the road as Caroline makes a fateful decision between the safety of her husband's benign, albeit insidious, dictatorship back at home in Florence, and her foolhardy and ultimately futile and irreversible challenge to male authority of climbing the tower. Laski gives the reader hints as to the unequal power dynamic in Caroline and Neville's relationship very early on. The way she triumphantly lifted her finger from the fine italic type in the Italian guidebook Neville was always urging on her, and is proud of how she has taken the car out alone for the first time, suggests that she's not been used to doing things by herself in this marriage, and that these small victories are baby steps on the road to independence. This becomes clearer in the section of exposition in the form of a flashback that fills us in on the events leading up to her day trip, as we realise that there is more than one reason why she has an almost compulsive desire to visit the tower. Not only does she feel a personal interest because of its link with Niccolo di Ferramano and his doomed wife, but her discovery of it before her husband will be a major coup. Laski presents Neville as a man who has been, over the 2 years he has lived in Italy before he first brought Caroline to Florence, in much the same way as one might bring a suitcase, very acquisitive in terms of cultural knowledge. He had been at least as concerned to accumulate Tuscan culture for himself as to disseminate English culture to the Italians. What more natural than he should wish to share, perhaps even to show off, his discoveries to his young wife? The way Laski uses a rhetorical question here suggests that we should perhaps be suspicious of his seemingly innocent motives to educate her. We get a feeling that Neville's acquisitiveness also extends to his wife and his desire for her to be his acolyte, more than a partner in an equal relationship. Neville can be described as an intellectual snob. He takes an excessive pride in his own knowledge to the extent that he is judgmental of others who don't live up to his high expectations. Caroline's own plan to work through one or two of the galleries and make a few trips before settling down to examining the Florentine shops is met by Neville with sneering contempt, because it is what the presumably undiscerning ordinary tourist would do. Note the contrast between the verb worked through, which suggests something that is a bit of a chore, and the verb settle down, which suggests relaxation and enjoyment. It's clear that Caroline does not share Neville's enthusiasm for Italian culture. Indeed, she has become almost anaesthetised to it, and is merely playing the part of the dutiful wife, adding such experiences to a dutiful collection. Trips to various castles and palaces to look at private collections, described as pilgrimages, evoking Neville's almost religious fanaticism, are, in contrast, boring for her, shown in the way she listened politely to Neville's lecturing and gazed with what she hoped was pleasure at the works of art on the walls. It's on one of these trips to a private gallery that Caroline spots, and is immediately captivated by, the painting by the eminent 16th century portraitist Bronzino of a girl who has a young face with calm brown eyes under plaits of honeygold hair. She learns from the name and dates under the picture that she was Giovanna di Ferramano, 1531 to 1549. Note how Caroline and Neville have completely different reactions to the portrait. She reacts emotionally, exclaiming, "Neville, she was only 18 when she died." Neville's response, on the other hand, is detached, academic and somewhat dismissive. They married young in those days. His statement of fact here seeming to indicate his unquestioning acceptance that it was perfectly normal practice for females to be married off as children. He's much more interested in a second portrait of a pale young man. There were no clear light colours in this picture. There was only the whiteness of the face, the blackness of the eyes, the hair, the clothes, and the glint of gold letters on the pile of books on which the young man rested his hand. This is a companion piece to the first, entitled Portrait of an Unknown Gentleman, but which Neville tells her is of the girl's husband, Niccolo di Ferramano. Laski now creates a sense of mystery and tension with the addition of some Gothic elements, as we learn that there is apparently some queer scandal about him, and though they don't turn his picture out, they won't even mention his name. The scandal seems to be related to the fact that his wife was either lost or damned. Neville's Italian wasn't good enough at the time to entirely understand what he was being told, and that the Hebrew and Arabic lettering on the books in his portrait suggests that he dabbled in black magic, or the occult. Note how once again it is Caroline who has a visceral response to the portraits. Caroline shivered. "I don't like him," she said. "Let's look at Giovanna again." The pair return their attention to Giovanna's portrait, and Laski creates an explicit parallel between her and Caroline by having Neville casually remark, "Do you know she's rather like you?" He means, of course, that she bears a superficial physical resemblance to her. But later on, when Caroline becomes trapped in the tower, lost or perhaps even damned, we realise that she actually has a deeper connection to her in terms of her relationship with her husband. There's also more than a passing resemblance between Niccolo and Neville. Niccolo's ostentatious desire to be known for his erudition, indicated by the pile of books in his portrait, is similar to Neville's own obsession with accumulating and showing off cultural knowledge. It's interesting to note that Niccolo's surname, Ferramano, translates as iron hand, and hints at his own controlling nature. We could argue that Laski is perhaps using the parallels between the two couples to say that no matter how much progress we seem to have made, women are still trapped by marriage, dominated and damned to a life of submission by the males in their lives. As we can see from their interactions, however, Neville's control of Caroline is superficially benign in that he's certainly not the villainous monster of traditional Gothic horror. He's not abusive, and he doesn't keep her physically imprisoned in order to terrorise her. The power that he does hold over her, that of self-entitled male privilege, which keeps her emotionally imprisoned, is, however, far more insidious in that her individuality is stifled by expectations that a patriarchal society endorses and perpetuates, and of which even she is not consciously aware. He makes her feel inferior to the extent that she doesn't feel like anything belongs to her, and that her safety is conditional on her passivity. Rather than take this lying down, however, it clearly irks her and provokes her somewhat rebellious behaviour. And how gratifying if she could at last have something of her own to contribute to his constantly accumulating hoard of culture. Note that this is not an epiphany where she has realised that she now loves Italian art, but it is rather a form of revolt, whereby she can feel less passive and dependent on the sense of security provided by her husband. And so it is this compulsion to step outside of her comfort zone, triggered by the memory of a man with a thin white face with deep-set black eyes that stared intently into hers, that spurs her on to make a decision that she otherwise would not have made. As we return to the narrative present, and she began to trudge up the dusty track towards the tower. Note how the verb trudge here suggests a degree of reluctance. Laski's descriptions of the inside of the tower create a sense of claustrophobia. It's described as having a low arched ceiling, through which a narrow stone staircase ascends, and narrow slits for windows that are too high to see from, with the only view of the outside far, far above, the deep blue evening sky, a small circle of blue framed in a narrowing shaft, round which the narrow staircase spiralled. Not only this, but it is rapidly getting darker, and the handrail is rusty, providing little protection were it to give way, from hurtling into the abyss that is at the centre of the tower. Despite this, Caroline feels compelled to continue, going against her gut feeling that it would be much more sensible to give up and go home. Laski uses the counting of the steps to punctuate the final part of the story, creating a mounting sense of tension with Caroline's position getting increasingly perilous as she climbs ever higher. It's when we get to the 269th step, over halfway up, that her hand moving forward on the railing met only empty space. And this forces her to press back to the brick on the other side. Note Laski's use of verbs as she continues her ascent, such as groped, pressed tightly, clutched and fumbled, which all appeal to the sense of touch. To communicate her sense of disorientation in the dark, and her fear as the breaks in the rail became more and more frequent. Not only is she battling against the inhospitable environment of the tower, but she is also undergoing an internal battle, which Laski communicates using direct speech, as she vacillates between wanting to go back down and feeling compelled to continue. Even she doesn't know why she is persevering. 422, 423, counted Caroline with part of her brain. I really ought to go down now, said another part. I wish, oh, I want to go down now. But she could not. It would be silly to give up, she told herself, desperately trying to rationalise what drove her on. Just because one's afraid. And then she had to stifle that thought too, and there was nothing left in her brain but the steadily mounting tally of the steps. She eventually reaches the top to find a narrow stone platform about a yard wide, which seemed to encircle the tower. Rather than a wonderful view, All she notices are that its stones are smooth and very shiny, before she realises that she is immeasurably, unbelievably high and alone, and the ground below was a world away. She is gripped by an attack of vertigo, where all her being was suddenly absorbed in the single impulse to hurl herself from the sloping platform. And now, rather than trying to save herself from the external dangers of slipping and falling, she is fighting to save herself from herself, as she frenziedly clutched the soft rotten wood of the doorway with hands sodden with sweat. "There is no other way," said the voice in her brain. "There is no other way." Note how Laski doesn't utilise speech marks here to differentiate this voice from her own inner speech earlier on, where she was arguing with herself, to suggest that she has no control over this one. After a moment where she remains frozen to the spot, unable to move, with the unrelenting voice in her head telling her that it would be much easier to fall, she at last manages to begin her descent. Note how Laski now uses the counting of the steps to ramp up the tension by evoking just how painfully slow the return journey is, with one entire paragraph devoted to a single step, as she is unable to go from the second to the third. 2, she counted, and then she thought of the depth below her and stood still, stupefied with terror. The only way that she is able to continue is to sit down and spread both her hands tightly against the step on each side of her, so that she can swing her body off the second step down to the third. At the 21st stair, she finally feels able to stand up once more, but now in the darkness something brushed her face. She knew it was a bat, not a hand, that touched her, but still it was horror, beyond conceivable horror. And it was this horror, without any sense of moving from dread to safety, that at last impelled her down the stairs. Note how Laski not only appeals to the sense of touch here, but also repeats the word horror 3 times to evoke how the terror and disgust overwhelm her, which is then compounded by the way the air around her is full of whispering, skin-stretched wings. Caroline, like an automaton, came down the dark tower. She could not think. She could know nothing but fear. Only her brain remorselessly recorded the tally. 501, she counted. 502, and 3, and 4. Note how there is no full stop at the end of the story, the dash here a form of ellipsis, suggesting that she has still not reached the bottom. The reader now realises the significance of the 470 steps at the beginning of the story. Laski deliberately leaves the ending ambiguous. Has Caroline become disorientated in the darkness and simply miscounted? Or did Niccolo di Ferramano, with his interest in the occult, cast some kind of spell on it so that she is trapped there forever? In other words, is she merely lost? Or is she damned? Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques, and English literature texts.